Greetings again. This is Dr. Beth, and we're looking at instruction and assessment for ELs, working with ELLs, or English language learners. This is the preparation section for Module 8. We're going to talk a little bit about students that don't speak English, fluent English, and it can be for a variety of reasons. It can be students from villages whose parents speak predominantly their first language or a combination of English and their first language. It could be students from other countries. There are a lot of reasons why academic English and English in general is not proficient. So there are a variety of iceberg models. We'll use this one for the purposes of this presentation. And on the top of the iceberg, you'll see basic interpersonal communicative skills, and we call that BICS. And that's the everyday language that you see. I'll spend a little bit more time with you. And then underneath the water, where the large part of the iceberg lies, you'll see the cognitive academic language proficiency. So you look at the difference here between conversational language at the top of the iceberg and academic language at the bottom of the iceberg. BICS, or Basic Interpersonal Communicative Skills, experts such as Jim Cummins differentiate between social and academic language acquisition. Basic interpersonal communicative skills are language skills needed in social situations. You see these guys riding their waterboards. It is the day-to-day language needed to interact socially with other people. English language learners employ BICS when they are on the playground, in the lunchroom, on the school bus, at parties, playing sports, or talking on the telephone. Social interactions are usually context embedded, and I'm going to look at that in a minute. I'll show you what that means. They occur in a meaningful social context. They are not very demanding cognitively. That means they don't have to work very hard to think about it. They don't have to sort through a bunch of translations in their brain to figure it out. The language required is not specialized. It's very general. These language skills usually develop within 6 months to 2 years after the arrival in the U.S. in the case of students who are coming from other countries, and depending on what kind of language support they get in school and in the community. Problems arise when teachers and administrators think that a child is proficient in a language when they demonstrate good social English. And that's a dilemma both for dialectal English speakers, such as some of our native language students, native Alaskan students, and other students who start to acquire English very quickly, but mostly acquire BICS quickly because BICS is fast. It happens fast because they need it and use it immediately. So it's less cognitively demanding, it requires face-to-face interaction, and it uses extensive gestures and a lot of context. It is language expressed through listening and speaking and is rarely seen in print form. So all the things these kids are doing there, they're using their hands, they're pointing, they're touching, they're explaining by gestures. First and second languages are in constant interaction. And if you remember, I mentioned before how important interaction is in terms of learning. That student-to-student interaction is the way second language learners actually learn the BICS best. Now we're looking at the other part of that iceberg, the cognitive academic language proficiency. CALP refers to formal academic learning. This includes listening, speaking, reading, and writing about subject area content material. This level of language learning is essential for students to succeed in school. Students need time and support to become proficient in academic areas. This usually takes from 5 to 7 years. Thomas and Collier's recent research, although now it's fairly old, has shown that if a child has no prior schooling, which you may encounter some of these students, or has no support in native language development, the original language development of their family, it may take 7 to 10 years for ELLs to catch up to their peers. So it takes a lot more time for different reasons for students to acquire CALP. Academic language acquisition isn't just the understanding of content area vocabulary, although vocabulary is important. It includes skills such as comparing, classifying, synthesizing, evaluating, and inferring. Academic language tasks are context reduced, and again, I'll explain this to you. Information is read from a textbook or presented by the teacher. As a student gets older, the context of academic tasks becomes more and more reduced. The language also becomes more cognitively demanding. So actually your second language learners are trying to catch up academically and they're trying to catch up linguistically. So they've got a double whammy when they're in school. The language, okay. New ideas, concepts, and language are presented to the students at the same time. Jim Cummins also advanced the theory that there's a common underlying proficiency between two languages. Skills, ideas, and concepts students learn in their first language will be transferred to the second language, or can be transferred to the second language. It depends on how closely related those concepts are. So academic language proficiency is related to the academic setting. It is more intellectually demanding. It is more abstract. And there is a time limit for clarification. And all of you know you have to move through the content. You have to move through the content. You have to move through the content. So what can you do to support students as they do that? So here we're looking at it again. This is what they talk about contextual support. So cognitively undemanding means it's easy. I say 2 plus 2, you say 4, I hope. And it is on a continuum to cognitively demanding, which is hard. The square root of 195. That's extremely hard. I'd have to really sit down and work that one out. So context reduced means there are few cues. Again, let's look at the concept of the word dihydrogen oxide. I don't know how many of you know what that actually means, but if we go back down the continuum and I show you a glass of water, you'll know that dihydrogen oxide is a glass of water, and H2O is the symbol for that water. So context embedded means that there's a lot of information around that. Context reduced means there's very little information and you have to have some background knowledge in order to understand it. So how does that affect your teaching, or how does it affect your setting up of lessons? You want to set up your lessons in what they call a Z mode for ELLs, and a lot of other kids too. So you start in the quadrant where you see it's cognitively undemanding and context embedded, and you use types of activities that that have a lot of information to them, and that the demand for information is not difficult. Now, some people might disagree with these because of the language used, and that's in fact true. So you just have to decide what really is immediately useful to a student in terms of language that would fit in this area. And then you go to the next level. It's still not very difficult, but you're reducing the context. You have demonstrations, audio-visual assisted lessons, science experiments, and social studies projects. So there's still more information, but it's more abstract. It's becoming more abstract. And really, quadrants B and quadrant C are very, very similar, and can easily go kind of the other way. But then you want to so you're scaffolding it. This is a scaffolding task. So you're scaffolding it, reducing the context. Maybe now you're reducing the demand. The telephone conversations are not as context embedded. You're reducing the context here. Here you're reducing the demand. Here you're reducing the context. Note on a refrigerator, written directions. So there's one step away from the original language. That's what you're reducing the context. You're one step away from the language. But they're still not very cognitively demanding because they're very immediately useful activities. And then finally D, where you have reading a textbook, explanation of new abstract concepts, lecture with few illustrations, math concepts, and application. And so this all is cognitively demanding. They have to be able to read. They have to be able to extract information from a text using their mind. They have to be able to figure vocabulary out. Lecture, if there's no context and doesn't have illustrations. Illustrations provide context, but don't be deceived by illustrations. They're useful, but they're not solely useful. Math concepts and application. So all that is more abstract. That's usually when you're looking at assessments. And you want to build students into that skill. So you want to move them from cognitively undemanding to cognitively demanding. You want to move them from context embedded to context reduced. And so it's a Z process, a scaffolding of taking away some of the supports. That's what WIDA talks about, taking away some of the contextual supports. so that eventually a student who is functioning here in BICS will be able to function here in CALP. You don't want not want them to be here, but you want them to support their progress to get here, the English language learners. So it's called the Z thing, scaffolding for instruction, moving from concrete to symbolic to abstract. And WIDA has their performance definitions of language proficiency. And again, it's the same kind of thing. They don't talk about BICS and CALP. They just talk about the levels of linguistic proficiency, language proficiency in English. And so this is something that all of you as teachers really need to familiarize yourselves with anyway. I don't know any schools, and there might be some who don't have any ELLs. But this, these levels of language proficiency are how students are identified for service in public schools. Very useful. And you can, if you were to look at these very closely, you would see that they really look like that whole embedded, context-reduced, cognitively demanding, cognitively undemanding, cognitively demanding work. So down here you'd have context embedded and cognitively undemanding language. They're able to use very simple, basic, everyday language. By the time they're fluent, they can use language that's cognitively demanding and context reduced, like a fluent English speaker can. So they're moving, even as language learners, they're moving from the social language to the academic language. Social language, academic language. And a lot of the kids, many of them fall in the levels of 3 and 4, just because that seems to be where they stop. And then they need to be kind of pushed on in order to get to the higher levels of language. This is just a really short version of language proficiency. So there are 3 levels to deconstruct language: word level, clause, and text, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on any of these. The word level is vocabulary. Vocabulary is the single strongest predictor of academic success for ELLs. It needs to be interactive. You give them rich experiences using vocabulary with a lot of different vocabulary activities, and wide reading experiences using teacher read-alouds up all the way through independent learning. Again, teacher read-alouds is that whole quadrant A, independent reading is that quadrant D. The importance of teaching vocabulary, you can just see that what I want you to understand, because when people say, oh, for ELLs, I'll give them a dictionary isn't going to help them if they can't read. A dictionary isn't going to help them if they can't read their own language. So a dictionary is used when a student is capable of using a dictionary, not because they're ELLs. But they do need to be able to look at words and figure out what they mean. And so anything you can use to teach them how to access word meanings and word pieces is very important. Some of you might be familiar with this kind of model, and this is the Freyer model of graph for vocabulary that a lot of people use. You can have kids make posters using these. You can do them in vocabulary themes for your lessons. So if you're teaching vocabulary words, they're going to make a themed model of each pair of students could make a poster of a vocabulary word, and then that would be your vocabulary list for that unit or even that lesson. Here's an example of it. Definition: this is a prime number, a whole number with exactly 2 divisors. Characteristics: this is what the characteristics of a prime number are. Examples of a prime number and non-examples of a prime number, which is why I like the Freyer model, because it uses non-examples. A content wall for vocabulary: you can set up a content wall. Maybe you can even include that in your lesson plan somehow, that you're going to set up a content wall using academic vocabulary from the lesson, and you say what the vocabulary is. And you see how nicely, the nice thing about this is they also come with a graphic. So you have your graphic and your vocabulary, your graphic and vocabulary, graphic and vocabulary. Clause level: breaking down complex sentences into a series of simple sentences. If I only put that on there, that would be enough. Students, especially ELs, especially students who are encountering high academic language, who have not been in school or have not learned English before they got to your school and they're in higher grades, or even in 5th and 6th grade, break them into simple sentences so that they can work with the language. Sentence starters, sentence frames, sentence close for writing are very useful. Transforming verbs into nouns. The reason for this, Here's the example. Scientists developed weed-resistant plants so farmers were able to produce more. It becomes the development of weed-resistant plants increased production. It shortens the sentence. It gives, these words have a lot of weight to them. This "we're able to" is a phrase that is complex English. So this actually simplifies the language and yet carries the meaning that you need. So anything you can do to simplify or, break down, maybe simplify isn't quite the right word, but break down the language of whatever it is you're having the students work on for ELLs is very useful. You can lift a sentence from a text. Moose, who was quietly grazing in the swamp, noticed her friends running by. So what do we know about what's happening to Moose? Moose was grazing quietly. Moose noticed her friends. Her friends were running by. So you've got 3 lovely phrases lifted from this one sentence. You wouldn't think that would be a very difficult sentence, but it actually can be. But this helps ELs access the language and access reading. Text level, show and tell using graphic organizers, which you will see you will all be using graphic organizers. I have graphic organizers in the lesson example. Realia, I love this word, nobody knows about it, but it's real objects. Realia means real objects. Things like when you're talking about water, it's a glass of water or a bottle of water instead of a picture. But if you don't have the real thing, then use a picture, right? And maps are always lovely. Text cues and so forth. So these are just some supports for you when you're setting up your learning opportunities for ELLs in addition to the objectives and the assessments. So you're pre-teaching vocabulary. You can front load the vocabulary using a strategy. Pause, ask questions, pause, review. You have to give them wait time and pausing. Get the gist strategies. One of them is get the gist strategy would be having students write 10 sentences in order of what they know happened in the text as they understand it. And it can be sentences as long as they're in order. At 10 sentences, that's the gist. So you want to reduce the language load when you're focusing on content and skills. So you want to front load as much as you can front load. And then you want to reduce the level of difficulty of content when you're focusing on language. So as a teacher and in these units, you're going to be focusing on the content. So how are you going to help reduce the language load for ELLs? This is your question. These next slides are just supports. You'll see that in the example, Realia has the example that is being submitted for your perusal, the nutrition example that I'm giving you to look at. We've got Realia in it. We've got a type of move it, some cooperative learning, numbered hands together. I think I have a sit down and stand up or a move and share. These are strategies. Now these are the strategies content. The dictionary, Cognitive Content Dictionary, what I used was a KIM sheet, K-I-M sheet, which is just a graphic organizer. And I did begin with the end, and I actually made sure to put it in there under strategies because it's just basically you review every time you go into a lesson. You just always review. And then some of these aren't going to be, you're not going to be able to put in your lesson, but you do want to be aware of it when you're teaching. I do, we do, you do together, you do independently. Anita Archer, she's awesome. Some of you may be familiar with her work. If you ever want to watch some really good instruction, just pull Anita Archer up on the internet and you'll find great examples. Plenty of performance-based assessment ideas from Colorín Colorado and Colorín Colorado. All of these are possibilities for you to use for your assessments. You can go to this website and you'll find a ton of support. It's really, really wonderful. So implications for instruction. Language acquisition is essentially a social activity. It is critical to second language acquisition. Meaningful interaction is the key. Third time. Students placed in a structured classroom where the teacher does most of the talking and the activities are mostly written have little chance for meaningful interaction or language development. Our knowledge of words determines how we understand texts, define ourselves for others, and define the way we see the world. Don't change what you teach, change how you teach. And then you have resources and references. So your next step on the note-taking template, write some notes and ideas in response to the questions in the English as a Second Language section. The completed graphic organizer will be collected in Module 8. So this is the section, English as a Second Language Cultural Capital. you've already written something here for cultural capital. Now 7 and 8 are the questions you want to think about for when you're designing your assessments and instruction for ELLs. How are you going to support them in this way? You'll have the PDF, you'll have the PowerPoint by itself as well as the screencast. So you can refer to them at any time at your leisure. And do consider these. Again, for this, you will not have to submit anything regarding ELs until Module 8. And that time you will be discussing what you'll do to help instruction and assessment for ELs. So with that, I'll leave you to Module 6 work. I expect you'll do a fabulous job. Have fun, and I'll see you in Module 7.